All right, today we are diving deep into the mind of a thinker who, and I'm not exaggerating here, completely changed the game of modern philosophy, Immanuel Kant. Look, to really get a grip on the world we live in, you've got to understand Kant. And this explainer, which comes to us from the philosophical exploration arm of Energy and Personal Excellence LLC, as requested by its founder, Sachin Karnik, is going to show you exactly how he turned everything upside down.
So here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the huge philosophical mess that Kant walked into. Then we'll see how one single philosopher nearly blew up the whole idea of knowledge itself. After that, we'll get into Kant's radical solution, his Copernican revolution. We're going to break down his blueprint for the mind, see how he cleverly made room for both science and belief, and then wrap up by looking at why we're still talking about him today.
You know, to really appreciate Kant's genius, you have to picture the world he was born into. It was basically an intellectual war zone. For decades, philosophy was just stuck, completely deadlocked between two major camps that just could not see eye to eye.
So on one side, you had the rationalists. Think of these guys as the mind-first crew. They believe that real, solid knowledge is built from pure logic and reason, stuff that's already inside our heads, totally separate from the messy, outside world. But then, on the other side, you had the empiricists. They were the world-first team. They said, no way, the mind starts as a total blank slate, and every single thing we know gets written on it by our senses and experiences. It was a complete philosophical stalemate.
And then, along comes David Hume. He was an empiricist, but he took their ideas to their absolute, logical, and frankly, kind of terrifying conclusion. What he came up with wasn't just another argument in the debate. It was more like a bomb that threatened to level the entire foundation of human knowledge.
And you can just feel Hume's impact right here, in Kant's own words. He famously said Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber. Now, what was that slumber? It was just, comfortably believing in the power of pure reason without really questioning it. Hume's arguments shattered that comfort zone and forced Kant to find a totally new way forward. So, what was this earth-shattering argument from Hume? Well, it all came down to this one simple-sounding question. He said, look, all we ever actually see is one thing happening and then another thing happening right after it. We see a lightning flash, then we hear thunder. We see one billiard ball hit another, and then the second ball moves. We see it happen over and over. But, and this is the killer point, we never, ever experience the cause itself. We never see that invisible force, that necessary connection that actually links A to B. For Hume, cause and effect wasn't some law of the universe, it was just a habit of our own minds, a story we tell ourselves.
And this was a massive, massive problem. I mean, if we can't be sure about something as basic as cause and effect, then all of science, all of it, just crumbles into dust. So in response, Kant came up with something so out there, so revolutionary, that we still call it his Copernican revolution in philosophy.
This right here is the 180-degree flip that Kant proposed. For centuries, everyone just assumed that our minds were passive. Like a camera, just taking snapshots of the world as it really is. But Kant, he flipped it completely. He said, what if it's the other way around? What if objects conform to our minds? What if our minds aren't just receiving reality, but are actively building it, structuring it from the ground up?
Now, this entire revolution was fueled by one single, incredibly important question. Kant looked at things like math and physics and saw that they seemed to give us knowledge that is both brand new and universally true. But how? How is that even possible? How can we know that something is true everywhere, for all time, without having to go out and test every single case? This puzzle, the puzzle of what he called synthetic a priori knowledge, was the master key he had to find.
Okay, so to answer that huge question, Kant basically had to become an architect of the human mind. He came up with a whole new set of terms and concepts to map out the deep structures that make our experience of the world possible in the first place.
So first, he split statements, or judgments, into two kinds. On one hand, you've got analytic judgments. These are basically just definitions. Saying a bachelor is an unmarried male doesn't teach you anything new about the world. It's true by definition. But synthetic judgments are different. They actually add new information. This table is brown connects the concept of table with something new, brown, that you had to learn from experience.
Okay, next up, he looks at where knowledge comes from. A posteriori knowledge is stuff you learn from experience, but a priori knowledge is stuff you know is true without needing any particular experience. It's universal. Think 2 + 2 = 4.
So here's where it all comes together in that one big question. How can we have statements that are both synthetic, they tell us something new, and a priori? They're universally and necessarily true. How can we know new truths about the world just by thinking?
And this is where we get to Kant's absolutely brilliant solution. The best way to get it is this ice cube tray analogy. Okay, so think of all the raw data coming from your senses, sights, sounds, smells, as just formless, chaotic water. It's just a flood. Now, your mind is the ice cube tray. The tray doesn't come with ice already in it, so you don't have innate ideas. But it does have an innate structure, those little plastic dividers. When you pour the water of experience into the tray, your mind automatically organizes it into these neat, understandable cubes. Concepts like causality or space or time, they aren't things we discover out there in the world. They are the shape of the tray itself. They're the organizing principles of our own minds.
So this idea leads to a pretty mind-bending and honestly a very controversial conclusion. Kant says we're essentially living in two worlds at once. There's the phenomenal world, that's the world of the ice cubes, reality as it appears to us, once our mind has shaped it. This is the world of science. It's the only world we can ever truly objectively know. But then there's the noumenal world. That's reality as it is in itself. It's the water before it ever hits the tray. And that world, Kant says, is completely and forever unknowable to us.
So you might be asking, okay, so what? Ice cubes, two worlds, why does any of this really matter? Well, it matters because by drawing this really sharp line between what we can know and what we can't know, Kant created this incredible system that could finally solve the biggest intellectual conflict of his time, the never-ending war between science and religious belief.
He laid this whole grand vision out in 3 enormous books, his famous critiques. And they weren't just 3 separate projects, they were one single, unified investigation into the power and limits of human reason. The Critique of Pure Reason asks, "What can I know?" and basically draws the boundaries for science. The Critique of Practical Reason asks, "What should I do?" and builds a foundation for morality. And finally, the Critique of Judgment asks, "What may I hope?" and gets into things like beauty and purpose in the universe. Now, the conclusion from that first book was a massive blow to traditional philosophy. Kant essentially argued that he'd proven we can never, ever have scientific, objective knowledge about the big metaphysical questions, things like God, free will, or the immortality of the soul. And why not? Because they aren't ice cubes. They're not things we can experience and process through our mind's built-in structures. If they exist at all, they exist in that noumenal realm, forever beyond our scientific reach.
And this brings us to what might be his most famous line. It sounds really destructive at first, but it's actually the key to his entire system. He said he had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. See, by proving that science has a hard boundary, that there are things it simply cannot talk about, he wasn't trying to destroy faith. He was actually building a firewall to protect it. He was carving out a safe, rational space for it to exist. And here's the brilliant payoff. Because science can never prove or disprove things like God or free will, we are completely rational and justified in believing in them for other reasons. Kant calls them necessary postulates for living a moral life. In other words, for morality to even make sense, we have to act as if we are free agents making real choices, and as if the universe has a moral order. He saved belief not by proving it, but by showing it was a totally different category from scientific knowledge.
So, how has this epic system held up over the last 200+ years? Well, Kant's work has pretty much been the foundation for, well, most of modern thought. One philosopher called it an inexhaustible source, and that's exactly right. It's something people are always coming back to argue with, and to be inspired by.
Of course, he's had plenty of critics. People argue that his ethical rules are just too rigid and abstract to apply to the messiness of real life. Others say his whole system traps us inside our own heads, forever separated from what's really real. And some have argued that he was way too focused on justifying the science of his day. But the very fact that these debates are still alive and kicking is proof of just how powerful his ideas were.
But here's the ultimate legacy, the one thing that is just undeniable. After Kant, you can never go back to the old idea of the human mind as just a passive camera, simply recording the world. He proved that we are all active creators in the construction of our own reality. And that, right there, is a revolution that can never be undone.
And so that leaves us with one last big, kind of personal question to chew on. If the very structure of your mind, that internal ice cube tray, is shaping everything you see, hear, and think, what does that mean? How much of your daily experience is the world as it is, and how much of it is just you?
For more information, please feel free to use the contact details you see on the screen. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.